Where are the beloved faces? There was a crowd of us. Now we are almost alone.
But for some, rather than sorrow, the plague brings the opportunity for looting, drinking, and brutality. In the empty houses of the dead, wild excesses overflow.
Sulle mani da lei! Quella è la mia donna! Maiale!
Florentine historian Matteo Villani is outraged.
Men gave themselves to the most disordered and disordered behavior more than ever before. They rushed headlong into lust.
Still, the vast majority of survivors neither sink into despair nor wallow in excess. Most simply pick up and get on with the process of living. They never lose faith in God, or, even more remarkably, their faith in the future.
Medieval people also had the assumption that God would make all things right, that God had a plan, that the apocalypse would set things right in the end, or that there would be a renewal, a restoration, that this was not simply the end, there would be something that would come beyond.
What's amazing in a way is how quickly these societies renormalized, re-routinized, became functioning societies again.
Their faith makes it possible for medieval people to not just survive, but actually go forth and multiply, according to French chronicler Jean de Venette.
When the epidemic was over, the men and women still alive married each other. Everywhere, women conceived more readily than usual.
The pause in violence will be unbearably brief. For even as society tries to heal itself, chaos erupts once more. The old mold has been smashed, and the new one will be shaped at the point of a sword. In all of human history, only a few events are watershed moments, when everything can be identified as either coming before or after. The Black Death is one of these.
When in European history has there ever been an event where possibly 50% of the entire population died in such a quick time? It's an event like this which we can barely wrap our minds around. How is it that you can wake up one morning and be dead by the evening?
The heart-sick survivors have no choice but to go forward, for pain and loss have shattered the past.
I've often wondered whether the sense of despair and the sense of irrationality with regard to what has happened opened up minds to questioning authority, but questioning how we understand God, and questioning to what degree there is an authority that we can all turn to.
The plague cracks the church's 1,000-year-old stranglehold on religion. Many nobles decide to take their faith into their own hands.
Some families began to hire private chaplains, so that there seems to be a kind of privatizing of religion that takes place.
While the plague turns some survivors closer to God, others look for new answers in science. In Avignon, France, plague survivor Guy de Chaliac is driven to write his masterpiece, the Chirurgia Magna, or Great Surgery. The authoritative text of Western medicine for the next 300 years. He bases it not on ancient philosophy and astrology, but upon his own first-hand observations of disease.
The plague had an important impact in the practice of medicine because when the plague arrived, the university-trained physician who was basically an internist and didn't do really any clinical medicine. His knowledge of medicine was all theoretical. After the debacle of the plague, medicine became increasingly more practical.
In the Italian countryside, another transformation is taking place. Prior to the plague, famine is common. Though every inch of land is sowed, supply never catches up to the soaring demand. Now, even with much of the land gone fallow, there is food to spare. For the first time in centuries, farmers can grow not just grain but luxury crops. And so, Italy becomes a country rich in olive oil and fragrant fruit.
Francesco, vieni giù ad aiutare! Non posso fare tutto da solo.
Sì, papà.
Italy's orchards underline a grisly fact. A sudden drop in population has its advantages.
As people died, wages rose. And as people died and lands were vacated, people who in the past were relatively poor could afford to begin to invest in land.
And what that meant was that all of a sudden people who had been peasants were now what we might call kulak class. They were now landowners. They had decent-sized farms and they could actually live independent lives rather than working the fields of others.
One of the interesting things is to look at the diet. Their diet, which is almost strictly grain-fed diet, ale, bread pudding, bread, now has quite a bit of meat in it, has some vegetables in it.
La cena è pronta!
Andiamo, figli.
But as the fortunes of peasants rise, the lot of the ruling class plummets. For centuries, nobles have depended on serfs to work the estates. Now, with better jobs drawing peasants elsewhere, nobles are left without a labor force, forcing them to gather their own bitter harvest. A clergyman gleefully notes how the mighty have fallen.
Churchmen, knights, and other worthies have been forced to thresh their corn, plow their land, and perform every other unskilled task if they are to make their own bread.
Ma che stai facendo? Ma come la stai usando quella zappa?
Marito mio, giuro che te la faccio mangiare
Ma
questa
guarda come
palla.
stai zappando, se la usassi bene, non staremo qua tutto il giorno.
Many impoverished nobles refuse to lower themselves to farm work. Instead, they seek their fortune the old-fashioned way, at the point of a sword.
We had a lot of military types running around. Sometimes they're employed by France or England or Spain or Catalonia or someone, in which case they're drawing a salary and looting cities for pay. Sometimes they're unemployed and they're looting cities to feed themselves.
To make up for the shrinking size of their armies, knights create new rules for an old game. Guerrilla warfare is born, and worse.
We have all these demilitarized men roaming the land, looking for opportunities to pillage. And that's really where things like scalping, for example, come from. It was the terror tactics of these groups of military men seeking to extort from villagers and from city folk.
The repercussions of a smaller workforce ripple into the more peaceful pursuits of commerce and industry as well.
Simply, the destruction of so many people forced the survivors to come up with labor-saving devices such as the printing press.
Industries that used to rely heavily on surplus manual labor, like the cloth industry, which used to be able to count on lots of dislocated peasants who didn't have land because there were so many people and the land was fixed. They can't rely on that labor, so they start to turn to other kinds of solutions, technological solutions, like mills,